Friends, hello. Today we have the second installment of our long series about the Second World War. If you haven't watched the first episode, the link to it will be in the description. Today, we will talk to you about 1940, the fall of Norway and Denmark, the fall of France, Dunkirk, and the Soviet-Finnish War. First, let's look at the map. In general, what was going on in the world as of January 1940. The Third Reich annexed other countries to its territory. Earlier, the Anschluss of Austria was made, then Czechoslovakia was seized, now Poland was seized. Part of Polish lands, western Ukraine and western Belarusia, became part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is engaged in a fierce, bloody war with Finland. In December, this war for the Soviet Union is going hard, and, frankly speaking, it was going badly at all. The Finns offer desperate resistance and deliver not only a painful blow, but directly sensitive, very sensitive blows to the Red Army. Europe is not all at war yet, that is, England and France, already British troops on the continent, and they are, let's say for now, partly on the line of contact with German troops on the Maginot Line. In Belgium and Holland, no war is yet being waged. In Scandinavia, no war is being waged. Spain and Switzerland have declared their neutrality. Portugal is also neutral. Nothing is happening in the Balkans, including Greece. Nothing is happening in Hungary or Romania. Moreover, Italy has not yet entered the war, because Mussolini, of course, is very itchy, but he is thinking how best to arrange it. So in fact, Italy is in the same position as in the First World War. It does not know why it needs this war, but there is something to be gained. That is why it is necessary to enter the war. Except that in the First World War, the Italians chose the right camp. It was the camp of the victors, the Entente countries. In World War II, they will make a mistake and play on Hitler's side. South America is not in a state of war. The United States of America is not at war. Africa as a whole is also still a peaceful territory. South Africa, of course, as a dominion, speaks of its support to Great Britain. But no military actions are being conducted in North Africa yet. They will be conducted later. Finally, Japan has been fighting a bloody war with China for some time. This is the situation. Everyone is waiting for the development, i.e., the war has already started. England and France declared war on Germany last year, but everyone is waiting for the real hot phase to begin. While the British are more practical, they believe that the war is imminent, and the French, for some reason, in the captivity of aggressive defense. We will sit behind a super defensive line called the Maginot Line. The Germans will never take it, so we will sit there as long as possible. Well, what does the Third Reich do? Hitler's Germany wages submarine warfare and sinks Allied transports that are going to England. That's the disposition. Well, we'll start with the Soviet-Finnish War. The winter in Europe in January 1940 is horrendous, cold, with huge amounts of snow. The Soviet Army, the Red Army, as it was then still called, is suffering huge losses, and the Finns in general, not that they are resisting, are defeating the Soviet Army. At the beginning of January begins the famous battle on the Rat Road, as a result of which the Soviet 44th Infantry Division is cut into pieces. Tank counterattacks on Finnish roadblocks fail. Moreover, the Finns cut the Soviet Infantry Division into pieces, surround the tanks, try not to burn them. They will need them themselves, just waiting for the people in the encirclement to freeze and starve to death. And those who try to get out, they are shot off by Finnish snipers. From the figures of statistics, in the battle on the Rat Road, 44th Infantry Division of 14,000 assigned personnel lost 99,000, that is, more than half. Material losses, 37 guns, 37 tanks, 150 vehicles, 280 tank and hand machine guns. That is, well, literally came out of the encirclement and abandoned equipment. The 44th Division lost more than half of its troops and was actually defeated. The 163rd Infantry Division was defeated, and the 18th Infantry Division was encircled, and there would be a situation where the Finns would cover the division with barbed wire. That is, people are surrounded, there is a forest around, snowdrifts, and right through the pine trees, through the fir trees. At different heights, the Finns wrap barbed wire so that no one could get out. And those who try to escape at night are shot by snipers. The situation is catastrophic, and in the middle of January, the tribunal will be over the command of the 163rd and 44th Rifle Divisions. The commander Kombrigh Vinogradov, the chief of the political department Commissar Pakomenko, and the chief of staff Colonel Volkov, as a result of the investigation, recognized that they were guilty of despicable skullduggery and were shot in front of the line. Stalin and the staff realized that the situation is catastrophic. That is, it is obvious that, having a huge superiority in manpower and equipment, Red Army of the Finns cannot defeat. Hitler looked at. It turns out that the Soviet Union is not so terrible, he cannot defeat the Finns. And the British and the French are seriously planning, on the one hand, to help Finland. That is, they are sending airplanes, weapons. They are thinking about sending part of the army there through Norway and Sweden. And the French and the British are planning to strike at oil fields, to bomb Baku, to bomb Poti, and to do it either from Egyptian English air bases or to bring the fleet to the Black Sea. This is being seriously discussed at the level of the French and British chiefs of staff, and at the level of the French president and the British prime minister. Hitler is busy planning. He realizes that the war with the British will further deteriorate. He was very unbelieving at first, when the invasion of Poland began, that France would actually declare war. He thought they would surrender Poland like Czechoslovakia, but no, they didn't, and declared war on Hitler. Hitler is planning a strike on the main British naval base in Europe, Gibraltar, which is on Spanish territory. The base itself is on English territory, but of course it's around Spain. You have to get the support of another dictator, Francisco Franco, and there's a long negotiation going on. Hitler says that, listen, Francisco Franco, you had the Spanish Civil War, we helped you. We sent you a whole Air Corps, Condor, to bomb the Republicans. Franco is a cunning fox. The Spanish will be grateful to the end of their lives for not dragging them into World War II. He is crawling away from Hitler with all four paws, saying that material conditions there are not the same now. We need money there. Concessions. He's doing everything he can to keep the German troops out. It is hard to attack Gibraltar from the sea. They tried to take it 2 centuries ago. It didn't work out, and now it doesn't work out. Of course, there is aviation, but it will not solve the case. We need a blow from the territory of Spain. The Spaniards do not want to let the Germans pass. Hitler plans this operation. It's called Operation Felix. But it never happens because Franco won't let the Germans through his territory. In January, another terrifying thing happens for Hitler. As I said in the first issue, they have already planned a strike on France, the Gelb Plan. And just imagine, the plan is not recounted orally. Everything was transmitted on paper. There were no chats, no phones. And here comes a German airplane, which by mistake gets lost in the fog and lands in Belgium, near the city of Mechelen. The Belgians say, "Hello, what's this?" And they start inspecting this airplane. There are 2 officers, and one of the German army officers has a briefcase. In the briefcase are secret documents, a complete, as movie makers would say, storyboard of the Gelb Plan. Which army, where it will move, where to strike, how to move forward. The Belgians protest and prepare a partial mobilization. Hitler, who had planned to strike this winter or early spring, apologizes, says, "This is all, of course, a misunderstanding. We did not want to hit anyone in any way." And in general, Hitler is furious. Simply, the secret documents were in the hands of the enemy. Hitler issues a decree which, in a nutshell, sounds like this. No top officer at any level, general, field marshal, cannot have secret information more than Hitler, so that everybody has information in pieces. Well, it is clear that this is so. In life does not happen. But nevertheless, Here is the end of January. Hitler is furious. In February, the situation in the Winter War, the situation in the war with the USSR and Finland begins to change. The Soviet command pulls up reserves and launches an offensive against the Mannerheim Line, a fortification not as strong as the Maginot Line, but nevertheless a threat and, in general, an obstacle on the Karelian Isthmus. And so the Soviet command, having pulled up the reserves, begins the offensive. At the same time, there, near Lake Ladoga, the 18th Division is still sitting in a siege. People there are eating horses, according to diary entries. The horses are finished. They are drowning snow to drink water, and so on. The situation is catastrophic. People with frostbite, kitchens are not working because there are no foodstuffs. Finnish snipers are working around. They are preparing an attack on the Mannerheim Line. What's going on with the French and the English? Here they are preparing for war with Germany, but the whole month of February, they are more occupied with the fact that they are planning strikes against the Soviet Union. And French President Daladier, without informing the British, says that he is ready to send 50,000 Frenchmen to the Finnish front to fight the Soviet Union. To do this, of course, no one will have time, but nevertheless, it is discussed at the level of an official statement. The British say that everybody is just admiring the heroism of the Finns, and everybody is condemning the Soviet Union. And increased supplies of equipment, increased supplies of airplanes, shells, and small arms to the Finns are being considered. Again, volunteers are fighting, and Swedes are fighting on the Finnish side in limited numbers, and volunteers, white migrants, are fighting, as they were called in the Soviet press at the time. But nevertheless, it's clear that very sporadic help. There is a story going on that moves Germany to take over Norway and Denmark. In the last series, I told you that there was such a cruiser, Admiral Graf von Spee, which in South America sank Allied transports, and then he was sunk himself. There was also a tanker, Altmar, which fueled this cruiser. Accordingly, when the Admiral Graf von Spee sank, the Altmar went to Germany. It sets out from the South Atlantic and goes as far as the coast of Norway. He has 300 prisoners on board. The prisoners are those members of the ships that were sunk by Admiral Count von Spee. They were picked up, and as prisoners they sit in this tanker, and the tanker goes to Germany. And so it reaches the coast of Norway. And then an amazing thing happens. An English destroyer begins to catch up with the Altmar. Altmar has taken refuge in the Norwegian fjords. Norway is a neutral country, and the British do not stop. They sail up to this tanker and take it, as in pirate times, to board. They free all their prisoners. During this action, 7 Germans were killed. During the attack, Altmar tried to leave, threw itself on the rocks, but then obeyed and left for Germany on its own, already without prisoners of war. And this incident is discussed in the General Staff, and Hitler said, "Look, Norway cannot defend its neutrality. Today, there is an incident with Altmar. Tomorrow the British and French will land there, seize bases, seize ports. But most importantly, they will cut the most important artery. From Sweden to Germany comes iron ore, which is needed by German industry. They will cut this artery, leaving us without iron ore. We need to work out a plan to take Norway." And it should be said that the British are thinking that it would be good, of course, to seize Norway and put these ports under control so that the Germans would not land there. And Hitler begins to develop an operation called the Weser Exercise, the seizure of Denmark, and the next immediate parallel seizure of Norway. But the attack on France is not abandoned. The secret documents are lost, the plans are all known, we have to think of something. And on the stage comes one of the greatest commanders of that war, von Manstein, who makes his plan. It's a plan that doesn't fit the German philosophy. The Germans have always attacked France across that borderline where the Maginot Line now stands. And Manstein proposes to strike where the French are not waiting, through the Ardennes Mountains, through Belgium and Holland. And this, of course, raises a question for the General Staff, and the so-called staff game is made, as a result of which this scenario is played out. Rash synchronization of the army, infantry divisions do not keep up with the tank divisions. In general, something must be done with this plan. But nevertheless, the German General Staff realizes that, in principle, Manstein's plan is good, and they dare to show it to Hitler. Hitler looks at this plan and says, "Look, but the document is good, we should accept it." And thus the new plan, Gelb, becomes Manstein's idea of a surprise attack where the Germans are not expected. If you and I move to the Finnish front, here the Soviet army has its first successes, having created a numerical advantage and launched an attack along almost the entire front. At the end of February, the Soviet army breaks through the Mannerheim line. Finnish troops retreat to the second line of defense. By the beginning of March, the situation for Finland becomes catastrophic. Mannerheim line is broken through. On the second line of defense, Finns suffer losses. In general, just a little more. And the Finns are considering a complete surrender and the capture of all of Finland by the Soviet army. And the Finns send an embassy to Moscow, a peace treaty. They see that the Allies will not help them, nobody will send any soldiers, they do not have enough weapons and shells, so they went to negotiate. Because it is obvious that the next step will be, in general, a complete occupation. The Germans are still engaged in the preparation of the plan, Exercise on the Weser. This plan envisages the following thing. First, to send by sea transports that take German soldiers to Norway, in parallel, a day later, to seize Denmark, to seize all Danish airfields, so that from them to carry out raids on the territory of Norway. And this document is being prepared for a long time. They are discussing the best way to execute this whole thing. Because there is the English fleet, which dominates the North Sea, and it brings certain problems for the landings. In England, the food situation is deteriorating. The Germans mistakenly believe that they, with their submarines, destroy every month up to a third of everything that sails to England. The English say that half on purpose exaggerate their losses so that the Americans begin to give military aid, supply arms, airplanes. In fact, the British are losing less than 20% of their monthly turnover. That is, of course, a significant hit, is taken by German subs, but not critical. There's another thing that happens in March, and that's just about the U.S. entry. The states release the results of a Gallup poll that asks respondents, if it turns out that Germany defeats England and France, should the United States, which has already declared war on Germany, send the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy to Europe to fight Germany? Yes, they should, said 23%, and no, they should not, answered 77% of those polled, meaning America is against war in Europe. Also in March, Hitler is shown a new plan to invade France, Manstein's plan, and Hitler approves it. Germany begins to develop it. On March 12th, after a short negotiation, a peace treaty is signed between the Soviet Union and Finland. The Winter War ends, and the treaty was signed on March 12th. Many troops at the front did not know it. And the Soviet army also takes Vyborg, although Vyborg had already been handed over under the treaty. There is a satirical moment. The Finns agreed to all the demands of the Soviet side to move the border away from Leningrad, to give control over all the islands in the archipelago, which control the Kronstadt Fairway and so on. Of course, nobody offered them any Karelian land in return, and the Finns made an offer referring to a historical document. That's when Peter the Great concluded the Treaty of Neustadt with Sweden, in addition to the territorial concessions that Sweden made to the Russian Empire. The Swedes agreed that Peter the Great would pay a contribution for the fact that the Russian army burned the villages that had died, and Peter agreed to pay some kind of contribution. Couldn't we also discuss this question of retribution? You have fought there, burned lands, killed people, to which Molotov said to the Finnish delegation, and you write to Pyotr Alexievich, if he signs it, we will pay. That is, in general, these were the dialogues with the Finnish delegation. April begins with a curio. the BBC broadcast what looked simply like a speech by Adolf Hitler, in which Hitler reminded the audience of radio listeners that Columbus discovered America with the help of German science and technology. Therefore, Germany was entitled to some part of the achievement. This meant that all Americans of Czech and Polish descent had the right to come under German protection. Hitler would enforce this right not only theoretically but practically as soon as the German protectorate was extended to the United States. Hitler also said that the Statue of Liberty would be dismantled to reduce traffic congestion. The White House would be renamed the Brown House, and all of this was broadcast on CBS. The American company contacted the BBC in a panic, trying to find out what was going on because people were listening to this in America and just getting ready to evacuate already. And the BBC said it's an April Fool's prank in general. Happy April 1st to you, folks. Actor Martin Miller was responsible for Hitler's voice. That's how April started. That's the fun part. From the unfunny, already without any jokes, Hitler, after clarifications, approved the final version of the operation Exercise on the Weser, capture of Denmark and Norway, invasion plan and time of invasion, 4:15, April 9th, 1940. So it's obvious the Germans will go to Norway. The British headquarters also have the same plans, to seize these strategic communications, seize the port of Narvik, Oslo, seize Trondheim, and other Norwegian cities. The Admiralty, together with the staff of the Land Army, is discussing how to do it better. At the same time, despite the fact that Finland has signed the peace treaty, the French and the British are discussing three options: bombing of Soviet oil mines in Azerbaijan, sea landing either through Turkey, stirring up any kind of separatist sentiments in the territory of the Soviet Union, sending saboteurs and some kind of trouble on the border so that then, too, to join there through the territory of Turkey, because oil is supplied by the Soviet Union to Germany, and it is a strategic artery. All this is being seriously discussed at the headquarters of the British and French. I must say that this becomes known to Soviet intelligence. And Kuznetsov, People's Commissar of the Navy, instructed the Soviet Baltic Fleet to consider the following in case of war. England, in an effort to restore the lost initial boundaries for an attack on the Soviet Union from the north, is trying to create a military defensive alliance of Scandinavian countries and Finland. Thus, the adversary on the Baltic Sea may be a Swedish-Finnish coalition. In addition, Voroshilov drafted a note to the Central Committee addressed to Stalin and Molotov, where it was mentioned about the transfer of the formations returning from the Finnish front to the south to strengthen the air defense and additional army formations in Baku, Tbilisi, Batumi, Tuapse, and Novorossiysk. Only for Baku, 7 divisions of small-caliber artillery were formed. That is, the Soviet Union was preparing for these bombardments. With the Finns, too, it was not all simple. At the end of March, beginning of February, the Finnish envoy met with Göring. Göring said to him, "It is very right that you signed with the Soviet Union in general, sign with them everything, on any terms, because soon we will go east. If you will be our ally, you will return everything and more." And the third moment, which was in late March, early April, Hitler meets with Mussolini and says, "Dear friend, you and I are here. We have an alliance treaty. We supply coal to Italy. We are preparing to hit the French and the British, and we are preparing to do it in the spring, literally April, May." To which Mussolini said that his army is not ready. "Let's take everything to September, 6 to 8 months we need." Hitler said that he does not intend to check his watch on Mussolini, and just take into account that we will start this war. You are either with us or you decide. In the Pacific, the Japanese, who realized that war was brewing in Europe, expressed concern about the possibility of changes in the status quo of Indonesia, which was then a territory of Holland. And so, if Holland was involved in the war in Europe, wouldn't the status of Indonesia change? And, in general, unequivocally start an information war? Japanese journalists calling for an immediate invasion of the island of Java. The American press calls for the defense of Dutch India in every possible way because Indonesia has oil, which the Japanese need. Well beyond that, the war begins to heat up. On April 8th and 10th, the Germans begin their plan for exercise on the Weser, the seizure of Denmark and Norway. On the 6th, German warships are transport ships under the cover of warships, destroyers, and battleships leave German ports in order to land troops in all strategic ports in Norway. Look on the map, it's Bergen, Stavanger, Kristiansand, Egersund further out, Trondheim, and quite a bit to the north Narvik. All the major Norwegian ports, the Germans send out a naval landing force to capture them. On April 8th, the Germans begin an operation in Denmark. Since the common border, quickly cross this border, throw out an airborne landing, and within 24 hours, the 8th of the day, capture Denmark. The Danish army surrenders. The Danish royal court is respected. They say thank you very much for the fact that your soldiers did not resist. There are some minimal losses. In general, it was very wisely done. We take Denmark under our patronage. There is a disarmament of the small Danish army. Its ships are included in the composition, and merchant, a few military, in the composition of the German Navy. And the Danish airfields. The immediate transfer of the German airborne fleet begins. On April 9th, German military transport ships reached Norway. I must say, the British let them through. They thought the fleet was moving into the Atlantic at all, and announced a grouping of their own to close the border with Scotland. In fact, they realized very late that the Germans were coming to land an amphibious assault in Norway, and at the Germans' landing happens at all as if by chance. Instantly, Bergen is captured, Stavanger is captured, Kristiansand, Egersund is captured, Trondheim, and even captured on April 9th, Narvik sea landing. In some places, these landings are supported by the air fleet. That is, parachutists are dropped from airplanes. The only problem was with Oslo because the German warship Blücher was sunk there. By the fire of coastal batteries, it was sunk, and the Germans for a while do not understand at all what to do because Oslo begins to defend itself. But eventually, they throw in an airborne landing force, take over the Oslo airport. The Norwegian army offers no resistance at all. But the Allies come to the rescue. On April 10th, there is a naval battle at Narvik in Norway, and the German fleet suffers losses there. The British and the French, together with a part of the Polish army, which remained in the British Isles, it is landed, begin bombardment of these Norwegian ports from the air and from ship artillery. And the British, the French, want to land the amphibious assaults. On April 13th, there is another naval battle. Again, the Germans suffer losses. Finally, on April 14th, the French-English landing force lands in Namsos. On April 17th in Åndalsnes, and the French-English-Polish army begins to move into the center of the country. And Hitler's already confused. He's ready to order a retreat from Narvik. But his general staff tells him, let's wait another 24 hours. And in 24 hours, the following happens. French, English, Polish troops are defeated near the town of Lillehammer. For the Germans, this whole situation is unfolding in the best possible way. By April 22nd, all of southern Norway will be captured by the Germans. Further, the whole war with the Allies will take place there, in the north, at Narvik. Encouraged by the way the situation on the Norwegian front is developing, Hitler realizes that he is able to launch an operation against France and Britain on the continent. And on May 10th begins the invasion of which the French are waiting on the Maginot Line. There, of course, phenomenal footage is absolutely newsreel at the end of the 39th year, December, the French military sledding, listening, gramophone records, wine, cheese sitting under the protection of long-term fire points. All is well with them, and all the press is rejoicing because the main pattern, the main leitmotif, is that we are the geniuses of this defensive war. We are sitting behind the Maginot Line, having learned from the First World War. The war will be positional, as it was then, with digging trenches and sitting in them for a long time. And we have here such bazookas that 4 floors down, there, and infirmaries, and food, and in general, the Germans will never break through. On May 10th, German troops completely unexpectedly bypassed this Maginot Line. Look at the map to see how the offensive developed. On May 10th, with swift blows, German troops entered the territory of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The operation begins with the capture of a fort in Belgium, a fort called Eben Emael, an impregnable structure. Well, as impregnable, of course, criminal, but bombarded by aviation, surrounded, cut off from communications. There are also several floors down, stunning, the most modern fortification. The Germans, conducting a special operation, landed the world's first paratroopers using gliders. Paratroopers land on gliders, blow up the top hatches of this fort with dynamite, throw grenades down there. In general, the entire population of this fort, all its defenders, surrender. Hitler awards all the participants of the capture of impregnable Eben Emael, and so on May 10th begins the operation in France, the Plan Gelb. The New York Stock Exchange reacts with lightning speed. On May 10th, stocks collapse. The world realizes that that's it. A serious war has begun. On the same day, the French army enters the territory of Belgium. The British troops, which stand in France, are transferred to France, also enter the territory of Belgium. The Belgian army, together with the French, should come to the aid of Holland, but it does not have time to come to the aid. For 4 days, the Germans take Holland and, subjected to cruel bombardment, during one day the city of Rotterdam. And seeing the devastation, the Dutch capitulate. Because the Germans said, "We're going to burn it all to the ground. Do you think we're toys or something? Come to joke." The Queen of Holland evacuates in the same way that, in general, the King of Norway evacuated before, along with the gold reserve. The Queen of the Netherlands will evacuate to Great Britain. There, in general, everyone will gather there, the monarchs of the countries that Hitler has taken over, and all the governments in exile will sit there. And the operation begins on the territory of Belgium. On May 12th to 15th, very hot tank battles took place near Anu and Jambla. The French put up fierce resistance, and it should be said that when we imagine all these pictures of Tiger tanks, the Germans did not have any Tiger tanks at that time. So the French are not inferior to them in terms of tank units. But the new doctrine of war, and the French historian Marc Bloch will talk about it later. We were outplayed intellectually, which is particularly humiliating. The Germans have indeed outplayed the French intellectually, made 12 hot tank battles, the French retreat. The Germans conduct their main mobile forces through Luxembourg and take note of French defense on the Maginot, Sedan line. It is already May 14th. That is 4 days offensive flies, just as from wheels. The day before, May 13th, the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill makes his first speech as Prime Minister in Parliament. Churchill would make many brilliant masterpieces of oratory, magnificent speeches. This is his first speech, which will be called Blood and Sweat. He declares the following to the parliamentarians: "I offer you only blood, labor, tears, and sweat. We have the hardest test ahead of us, many long months of struggle and suffering. You will ask, what is our course? I answer, our course is to wage war at sea, on land, and in the air, with all our might and with all the power that God will give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny that surpasses any example in the dark and deplorable history of human crime. This is our course. You ask, what is our goal? I will answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of the horrors. Victory no matter how long and hard the road to it may be, because without victory, we cannot survive." On the 13th, Churchill makes this his first famous speech. But victory is as far away as the moon. No victory is in sight. Moreover, the catastrophe is just beginning. By May 21st, tank units of the German Group A reached the Atlantic coast, thereby cutting off the forces of the French First Army Group and the British Expeditionary Corps. That is, the French and British were pinned to the sea. There's water behind you, The French try to counterattack from the flanks, the Germans hold back these blows and squeeze the pincers. Despite the fact that a very complex landscape in Belgium, many rivers and many canals, the Belgian army loses bridgehead after bridgehead, and the British try to come to the rescue sometime. But the situation is catastrophic. Belgium is on the verge of surrender. The Belgian king is also preparing to evacuate to London because he realizes the forces are unequal. The German army is mobile, more modern. It is much better at fighting. And, in general, the Belgian army at that moment is not completely destroyed, but actually exsanguinated. On May 25th, the question comes up in London, we have to evacuate our units by sea. I highly recommend you see how it was in the terrific movie Dunkirk, directed by Christopher Nolan. 16 kilometers from Dunkirk German Corps. French-English troops in the city of Dunkirk, and they are on the beaches, standing in columns and waiting for evacuation. Military vessels, transport ships, all begin evacuating the British Army. The French hold the perimeter, hold the defense. The British evacuate first. That's very interesting, too. On May 24th, a miracle happens. The head of these armored forces, Paul von Kleist, appeals to Hitler for permission to storm Dunkirk, and Hitler stops. He says, "Don't storm anything. Now we'll have tanks bogged down here. We'll lose our mobile groups. Don't. We'll just bomb them." And the most brutal bombing of these unfortunate soldiers who are lying, sitting on the beach, hiding under the piers, hiding in the city begins. Well, and in parallel, the French hold the perimeter. The German infantry begins to storm Dunkirk. Inexplicable thing, at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the Germans transmit an unencrypted message in which the German military command ordered the troops to stop on the line Dunkirk, Augsburg, Merville. And this message is intercepted by the British services, British intelligence. In parallel, there is a siege of another city near Dunkirk, the city of Calais. In 3 to 4 days, the Germans take the town of Calais. Luftwaffe on the 24th begins to massively just throw bombs at Dunkirk. British planes are flying from the islands trying to shoot down the bombers. And under this terrible fire, the British Army evacuates. There are not enough ships, and the government turns to ordinary people, British citizens who have experience in navigation. Mostly coastal citizens asking for help. And so this huge fleet of hundreds of schooners, big motorboats, small ships, this whole fleet starts to go to Dunkirk. Some are drowned as they go, some drown themselves, some manage to swim 2 or 3 times between Dunkirk and Dover, an English town. This is the whole evacuation under constant fire. It's a brutal example of how modern warfare is fought. The British call this operation Dynamo. Nevertheless, we manage to evacuate the group. The group throws all the equipment, tanks, guns, machine guns, everything that was. The ship will not take it. Halfway to England, they were bombed. Many ships were sunk. Anyway, just to give you an idea of the volume, there are 300,000 British and French soldiers in this encirclement. And so this whole grouping begins the evacuation from Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo takes place through June 4th. During this period, Belgium surrenders, and King Leopold, who is already in London, he writes a letter that he doesn't recognize this surrender. But it doesn't matter who doesn't recognize what, Belgium doesn't exist anymore. The last French and British units leave Dunkirk on the night of June 3rd to 4th. In total, 224,000 British soldiers, 120,000 French and Belgians were evacuated during Operation Dynamo. Initially, the British did not count on such success at all. There were different figures. To evacuate 60,000, to evacuate 100,000 maximum, it is impossible to do it under fire. As a result, they evacuated a completely unrealistic number of people. On the night of June 3rd to 4th, the last units were brought home to England. There they were already put on trains and taken further to London, to hospitals, to home, to the location of the units. During the Dunkirk operation, the Luftwaffe for the first time showed that they were unable to destroy the British Air Force. Let me remind you that the Luftwaffe is a type of airship. The British were absolutely heroic in flying off the islands and shooting down the Germans, and the Luftwaffe were not up to the task. So Hitler stopped the tanks. We'll kill them all with airplanes now. But nothing happened. And then, for the first time, Göring was charged. You are Reich Minister here, responsible for all aviation. How are you preparing for the battle for England if you even Dunkirk could not bomb? Well, long or short, at 9 a.m. on June 4th, Dunkirk fell. The British Expeditionary Corps is squeezed off the continent with a Scottish division remaining. This is, of course, the unhappy history of the Scots. During the Crimean War, the Scots stood to the death. In Norway, they're still fighting in the Narvik area, and the Scots are standing to the death there too. In France, there remains a Scottish corps. The Scots are indeed, in many wars, a people who show marvels of valor and heroism. Well, I mentioned Norway. What happens when France and Great Britain actually lost all their most capable forces on the continent in the month of May? In Norway, things are a bit of a mess. June 3rd to 8th, the Allied evacuation begins. Before that, the Allies had victories in Norway. On May 28th, the city of Narvik was captured, liberated from the Germans in the north. But it did not last long. On the third day begins the evacuation of all troops. June 8th, it ends. June 16th, Norway is captured. All ports, all airfields under German control. What does that mean? It means planes will bomb England from Norwegian airports. It means submarines will be based in Norwegian ports. Parallel to the disaster of the French and British, what happens in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, emboldened by its victory over Finland, begins a new phase of pressure on the Baltics. The reasons are different. The first reason is that Soviet intelligence intercepts a report that the governments of 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have concluded an agreement on the Baltic Entente, so that together they could coordinate their actions and not be lost on their own. Naturally, Moscow interprets this to mean that this entente is anti-Soviet. It will join either England and France, which yesterday wanted to bomb Baku, or it will join Germany, with which we have a peace treaty and a border treaty. But Stalin realizes that Hitler will probably not stop, so they start putting pressure on the Baltics. Soviet soldiers go missing. Either it was a drunken skirmish and they disappeared, they were killed and buried somewhere, or they ran away, and with the help of local authorities went somewhere in Europe or disappeared altogether. But nevertheless, on May 25th, Molotov summoned the Lithuanian envoy in Moscow and handed him a note in which it was written that the disappearance of servicemen Nosov and Shmovanets was organized by some persons enjoying the patronage of the Lithuanian government bodies, accusing the Lithuanian government of provocation. Molotov demanded to stop these provocations, to search for the missing soldiers, and to return them to their units, expressing the hope of the Soviet government that Lithuania would meet his proposals and would not force the Soviet government to other measures. The Soviet government, at the same moment, is preparing to increase its military contingents in the Baltic countries. And in the next stage, the Soviet government is preparing to bring its own pro-Soviet governments in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to power, which would be absolutely loyal to Moscow. On the other hand, the Soviet government is looking at Bessarabia and Bukovina, which Romania has ceded. The Moldavian territories that were taken away by Romania as a result of the First World War, and he sort of starts saying that he wouldn't mind getting them back. The Romanians are confused. They're Germany's economic partner. They start consulting with Berlin. Berlin realizes that Moscow is more important than Bucharest, and they receive Romanian envoys in Berlin, but they tell them, if the Soviet government gives you an ultimatum on Bessarabia and Bukovina, you agree with it, of course, we will not come to your aid. We have a peace treaty with Moscow. You, please, better make all their concessions, because the Finns didn't. That's what happened. It will be the same with you. The Romanians realize that they can expect no help from anywhere. Mussolini keeps trying to choose which chair he has what on. He'll end up between two chairs. He wants to go to war, but he's got the church against it. He's got the aristocracy against it. He's got the people who know whether he's for it or not. Well, he kind of sees France starting to settle down. It wouldn't be a bad idea to go into French territory, grab something. But so far, Mussolini's hesitating. And the Germans, after kicking the British Expeditionary Corps off the continent, they started bombing Marseille and are bombing Paris. And these German troops who stood at Dunkirk are turning towards Paris. It must be said that after Dunkirk, the French are in a catastrophic situation. They lost a third of their army and the best third, and they are trying to create the defense of Paris with small forces on new borders. The Germans strike the first blow on June 5th in the direction of Paris, in the direction of the Seine River, and it takes them all 3 days. On June 8th, German troops reach the Seine, pin the remainder of the British and French to the sea, dismember what remains of the British Expeditionary Corps, and force them to evacuate to the islands. On June 9th, in eastern Paris, the Germans strike to the rear of the Maginot Line. So here is the Maginot Line on the map. First, we broke into Belgium. Then, we crushed the English by the sea, turned around, and went to the rear. That's it. The Maginot Line, which was so proud of, did not even participate in the war. It was doomed to a shameful surrender. Already on June 14th, Paris fell. And on June 17th, German troops surrounded the French grouping, occupying the Maginot Line, and went as far as the Swiss border. Switzerland has been a neutral country since World War II. These are the famous Swiss banks you've probably heard of. All their wealth will come from there, because Jewish capital, which is fleeing from Germany, will end up in Switzerland. Then officers, generals of the Third Reich will keep their money there. Half of the deposits will be unclaimed after the war. Switzerland is forging its own prosperity. It's a neutral country, but the Germans came to the Swiss border. The French, of course, are completely demoralized. They have no desire to resist. France is dismembered, and these days there is a change of government. Instead of Prime Minister Renault, the head of France was Marshal Pétain, who immediately made a peace proposal. On June 22nd, the French-German armistice was signed. It was signed in the same railroad car in which the surrender of Germany in World War I was signed. And Hitler did not wait for the signing, got up, left the table, expressing contempt for the French soldiers. France capitulated, and here's the important point. The French, of course, don't like to admit it, but it's not like France is out of the war. No matter how we capitulated, we are no longer at war, no. The new Pétain government, which will be called the Vichy government, because they will have their seat in the city of Vichy, in the spa town where the famous Vichy water is. Actually, this new French government, it also capitulated, but did not withdraw from the war and became an ally of Germany. And further there in the next parts of our series, we will see how the British will deal with the French, so that the French fleet did not get to the Germans. But for now, the surrender, the whole campaign took 2 months. And it was probably the most unexpected defeat. Here it is, Blitzkrieg. Here it is, Lightning War, when within 2 months captured half of Scandinavia and captured Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. What is happening at this moment in the other part of Europe, in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union begins to pull troops to the borders of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The troops are instructed that the Baltic Entente is completely anti-Soviet in nature, which is a violation of the pacts, which prohibit participation in coalitions hostile to the contracting parties. It means the pacts of 1939, which the Soviet Union signed with the Baltics. On June 15th, Soviet troops entered Lithuania. Lithuania was given an ultimatum to dismiss Minister of the Interior Skučas and the head of the political police department Pavaitis, and Lithuania accepted this ultimatum. The Italians and the Spanish are not slumbering. Taking advantage of the French collapse, The Spanish occupied the demilitarized zone in Africa, the city of Tangier. The Italians finally entered the war on June 13th. Italian planes bombed French airfields. Next, they're bombing Malta. In general, the Italians were not very successful warriors, because they planned a raid on Marseille, bombed their own Italian positions. Well, Mussolini, the marshal, was outstanding, in quotes. Latvia tries to defend itself, and after a Soviet ultimatum, Ulmanis, president of Latvia, appeals to Germany to allow the government and army to evacuate to East Prussia, but is refused. On the same day, June 16th, the Latvian ambassador informs Molotov that his government has agreed to meet all Soviet demands. Soviet troops cross the Lithuanian border on June 17th. A few days later, Soviet troops will cross the Estonian border, and Stalin is wildly bombed by the German success in France because such a lightning success was not expected by anyone, not the British, not the French, no one. And Stalin seeks to secure himself. He realizes that the next on the map is him, and Soviet troops to the Baltics. Pro-Soviet governments are formed in the Baltic countries. The Soviet army is given their phrasebooks, textbooks, on how the Baltic countries are organized. That is, in fact, the Soviet troops receive instructions on how to behave in these new territories. So far, there is no talk of the Baltic countries joining the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, pro-Soviet governments will be formed in all countries by the end of June. I have already spoken about Churchill's speech, and in addition to the first speech about blood, sweat, and tears, the following two speeches were made. The first is the speech of June 4th, which was made by Churchill in Parliament after the surrender of Dunkirk. It is obvious that the situation in which this speech was made in Parliament was catastrophic. The whole society was demoralized by the shameful defeat on the French fields. The nation and the elites had to be galvanized somehow. And Churchill makes a brilliant speech called, "We will fight on the beaches." The final line of the speech is as follows: "We will continue to fight to the end. We will fight in France. We will fight on the seas and oceans. We will fight with the strongest confidence and growing strength in the air. We will defend our island no matter what it takes. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight on enemy beachheads. We will fight in the fields and in the streets. We will fight the hills. We will never give up. And even if, though I don't believe it for a moment, our island, or most of it, is enslaved and starved, then our empire across the seas, armed and guarded by the British Navy, will continue the struggle until, God willing, the new world with all its strength and power will come to rescue and liberate the old." The speech was so insanely pathetic that the entire press applauded Churchill wildly. It had an absolutely stunning effect on the public, truly uplifting words. What's going on in the New World? The Americans get a request from the British to lease warships, and they are not in a hurry to fulfill it, because Roosevelt refers to the fact that it must be approved by Congress, we need new appropriations, and so on. From the beginning of the war, Roosevelt issues an executive order. All submarines and warships of all belligerent European countries are not allowed to enter American ports. That's one part of this New World thing. And in the other part, in Japan, the Japanese realize that, there is no more influence from France or England. The Japanese proceed to form a pro-Japanese Chinese government in Nanking to declare it the only legitimate government and to subjugate China completely. Chinese Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, they appeal to the Soviet Union for help against the Japanese. They ask Stalin for a joint strike. Stalin puts it all on the back burner. The Japanese are pushing through the French and banning the French and British from supplying any arms to the Chinese, who are fighting them through Burma and through Thailand. And the Japanese realize that now the Europeans can be pressured quite safely. And at that moment, the American-Japanese War was being prepared. The Japanese come up with the concept of Great Asian Prosperity, that under the shadow of Japanese flags and sakura trees, there will be great prosperity. This whole region will be Asian, Japan will be in charge, and we will rule here as we want. That is, the Japanese realized that now they will be the Germany of that hemisphere. On June 22nd and June 23rd of the 40th year, Hitler made a study tour of Paris after signing the French surrender at Compiègne Forest. These are the famous pictures. Hitler in a leather cloak looking up at the Eiffel Tower. Paris is in mourning. Paris is extinct. The city is humiliated. The nation is humiliated. What's more, a large part of French society is saying, "Why did we even fight such an inept battle?" Here's Marc Bloch saying, "We've been intellectually defeated. Why did we have to do all this in the first place? We have to get out of this war. We don't need this war." That is such a defeatist mood in society. There will of course be a French resistance. One of those who will lead the military in exile will be General de Gaulle. But there will be some horrible scenes. The French are standing in line at the Hotel Lutetia not to have breakfast, but to come to denounce. Mostly on Jews and communists, because the building of the Hotel Lutetia was the headquarters of the SS. This whole situation is also, of course, tragic for France. Our friend Mussolini sent a letter to Hitler on June 26th asking him, when the time came to bomb London, to allow Italian squadrons to participate in revenge raids for the British bombing of Turin. Well, how it turned out. The Italians started bombing French units in Algeria and English units in Malta, bombed unsuccessfully. The British responded by bombing Genoa, Turin, and Milan. And so Mussolini then wrote a letter to Hitler. "If you bomb London, take us too." Absolutely jackal logic. Indeed, London would be bombed because Hitler was targeting the operation, airborne landing, naval landing on the English islands. And so this operation has begun to be developed, and the next 6 months are going to be very difficult for Britain. Britain is preparing for war. It's clear why Churchill was speaking so often. A nation needs a constant morale boost, and here it is on June 18th, a few days before France surrendered. He knew that France would capitulate, and it was clear the situation could not be saved. And so he made a speech in Parliament, their finest hour. "If we are defeated, then the whole world, including the United States, including everything we have ever known and loved, will plunge into the abyss of new dark ages, which the perverted fruits of science will make even more horrible and perhaps more lasting. So let us prepare to do our duty and behave in such a way that even if the British Empire and the Commonwealth exist for another 1,000 years, people will still go on saying this was their finest hour." Certainly a brilliant speaker. Well, and a brilliant politician. Finishing this half year, we can say the following. In Latvia, on June 28th, there was a 2,000 demonstration of Russian peasants under red flags. In Lithuania, the government legalized trade unions, the activity of which had been forbidden before. And on June 28th, NKVD border guards seized the bridges over the Dniester, and tanks and infantry of the Red Army entered the territory of Bessarabia. The day of liberation of Bessarabia is June 28th. Here began the operation in northern Bukovina and Bessarabia. Romanians tried to save themselves with the help of Germany. Germany refused to help them. As a result, the Romanian units were withdrawn, and without war, without military action, Bessarabia and Bukovina went to the Soviet Union. In Latvia, by a decree of the Kirchenstein government, the Communist Party of Latvia was allowed to operate legally, that is all. The Baltics are under the control of the Soviet Union. The war begins in Africa as well. After France surrenders, some French colonies refuse to recognize the new Vichy government. On July 1st, Italian troops launched an offensive in East Africa against British Somalia and Kenya. The Italians, in the good tradition of the Roman Empire, went to Africa to fight their Carthage. In London, General de Gaulle formed the Fighting France movement, which did not recognize the French surrender. And now the British armed forces, together with detachments of Fighting France, will continue to fight the Vichyists for control of the remaining French colonies. Well, and I want to end this issue with an excerpt from one diary, June 30th, 1940. Germany is on the cusp of supreme triumph, having just captured Norway and France. A conversation between the Chief of Staff of the OKH and Weizsäcker, State Secretary of the Foreign Office, which took place in Berlin, touched on various political issues. German General Galder recorded the following in one sentence in the pages of his service diary: "Eyes are turned to the east. Germany is preparing for an attack on the Soviet Union." Friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for being a history buff. We'll see you in the next episodes. Peace and good luck, everyone.